yeah.
Hey, so I've been talking offline with Olivia Waite, but we're going to invite you guys all in. We have been reading A Lady's Guide to Celestial Mechanics this month and enjoyed it very much. So Olivia's going to be with us today, and she writes erotic, paranormal, historical romance, sometimes at the same time, sometimes separate.
Yep.
And Lady's Guide to Celestial Mechanics was a female historical, which I absolutely loved. Also, it struck me as a very kind of, I don't know if traditional is the right word, but kind of like a traditional feeling sort of love story, as far as, like two people meet, they're around each other, they, like the evolution of it, and then also what their dreams were for their relationship at the end was very, like, it felt very familiar, even, just like this is how people fall in love. Which
Well,
was
that's what I kind of set out to do was, as a reader, I wanted to read a classic Avon style historical with two heroines. And so I was like looking everywhere for this, and I was bugging the Avon reps to send me one. And they're like, I don't know if we have anything like that. Let me check. No, we don't. And I started looking among the indies and the self-pub, and I found some great books, but I didn't find this one thing that I was looking for. And then I'd finished a project and I didn't know what to write next. And I thought, well, like, I could try this. I know exactly what it sounds like. I have this older idea about like an older widow and a young scholar, and I just flipped that young scholar into a woman and the thing still works. And I'm like, I'll just work on this until something marketable comes along. And I just absolutely fell in love with it. And the voice was just kind of waiting there. I knew it should sound sparkly, and I didn't anticipate all the embroidery stuff becoming involved. But I wanted something for the widow to be as passionate about as the scholar was about astronomy. And so it all kind of just started to come together, and I got really excited, and I had all these thoughts, and about halfway through I sold it as a 3-book series.
nice.
Yeah, so I mean,
Halfway through, you say.
yeah,
It's starting to sound familiar.
Yeah, it was definitely like kind of, it all happened very fast, and it was all very unexpected. And because you should finish your manuscripts before you query. This is important. Finishing a manuscript is kind of the thing we're all here for. And this time it just didn't end up working out that way. Like every time I sent like the first few chapters off, people were like, oh my God, yes, whatever this is, I want it, yes. And I'm like, oh.
We're like, I thought this wasn't the marketable one.
Yeah, like there was a need out there that everybody was feeling. It wasn't just me being strange.
No, it was not just you. I thought that there was a really beautiful way too, the way Catherine and Lucy supported each other. And there was a point in the story where I thought that Catherine was also going to be kind of science-y because of her interest in botany and all of that. And I thought it was super interesting that Lucy was like, oh, but you are kind of a scientist. And she was like, no, not really. Because I think in real life that happens a lot where you like somebody, you want like, oh, we have all the things in common. But it was really both the things they had in common and the things that were different between them that made them such a good match for each other. It was really fun to read for me.
One of the things that was important to me about this was because I love scientist heroines. I really do. I love women in science and people in science generally. And there's kind of an alternate history of my own life where I went into either astronomy or marine biology, or my God, I could study cuttlefish forever. Like really geology possibly, like, all of these different branches, they always really fascinated me. But I ended up in creative fields because I kept getting distracted by the stories involved. Like, oh my God, I'm terrible at physics, but I love it. I love all of the stories. I love the history of physics. I love the weirdness of things like string theory. And yeah. So part of me feels very conflicted about science, because on the one hand, I do think it's wonderful, but on the other hand, we hold up science as so superior to art in a lot of ways. Like I think the term I've seen around is like scientism, where it believes that science is kind of will save us all and is way more significant than the humanities. It's more serious. It's more substantive.
Yeah.
I kind of think that's crap. So, like, so I really wanted to bring in a balance to that kind of thing. I wanted to say, well, yes, it's wonderful when people are doing science, and some parts of science are really boring but useful, and also art is really important, and it doesn't always look like what you think, and science doesn't always look like what you think.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, basically there's a reason I wrote a whole book about this, because I have like so many thoughts.
No, I love it. And actually, I in my day job, I work with a lot of doctors. That's my dog. If you hear a groaning, it's my dog. But yeah, I work with a bunch of doctors. A lot of them have very kind of creative lives outside of their own day jobs. And I think it's interesting that in science, you have to be able to think creatively and think outside the box if you're ever going to be,
Yeah.
good in your field.
Yeah, all the breakthroughs are imaginative. They really are.
Right. But creative people, if they're ever going to like finish the book or do anything with their career, I think it was Picasso that was like, at some point you have to stop and just be done. But it also requires discipline, and it requires study and craft, and like being able to work at something meticulously until you've got it just the way you want. And I don't know that that's what people generally think of when they think of like an artiste.
Yeah, exactly. No, we think of this kind of like magical force flowing through you, and this kind of muse and inspiration, this very glowy thing, which actually does stem from like this early 19th century, like all the romantic poetry and the way that painting was talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Comes back to this idea of art as this transcendent experience separate from earthly life. And it's like, no, you got to put the paint on the canvas, like, and you got to learn how to do it in the right order. There's techniques, there's science involved. Like, one of my earlier books had a heroine who was a chemist, and she was the daughter of a famous woman painter.
Oh, nice.
And so a lot of it was about the chemical composition of paints, how she'd gotten this particular shade of green, and like this idea about the different way you layer paint on canvas to get different effects. And it was amazing. And that comes up in, I think, is it Meredith Duran's Duke of Shadows has a whole thing about the construction of these paintings and how that ends up tying into issues of character and memory and history. And it's like, it's fascinating.
It's pretty amazing. Yeah.
I blame the painting scenes in Jane Eyre, honestly. I'm like, ooh, what's this about like a face coming out of the ocean and a crown, and so meaningful.
It's funny. Well, you do tackle some pretty big issues too in this book, like both in the world of science and in the world of art, I think, like issues that women face, and also, like you said, what's considered like science and what's considered art. Which, was that something that you started, like from the beginning, you started out wanting to tackle those things, or did it make
Well, that actually came, so when I started, I thought, okay, time to research lady astronomers. I know plenty of them existed, and I started with, of course, Carolyn Herschel, who's kind of the big one. And the more I read, the more I'm like frustrated, because Carolyn Herschel was brilliant, but she didn't really correspond with a lot of other women. She wouldn't have been quite so supported if she didn't have her brother, who discovered a planet, kind of there, insisting that she be included. Like, people are, and she was kind of, I don't know, it felt really lonely. And so as a template for a romance character, it was kind of the worst. Which was really frustrating. And now I have all sorts of like uncharitable thoughts about William Herschel as well, which is like, its own whole thing. I was also trying not to read too far into the future, because then I would pull in Victorian things into the Regency, and like, because my brain, I have to stop at the year I'm working on, or else my brain will like kind of jam the wrong things in there. Which is the trouble with having like a magpie kind of mind. But and then I discovered an astronomer who was slightly later, but who was honored by the Royal Society at the same time. And this woman's name was Mary Somerville. And her first husband didn't want her studying astronomy. Like, she's self-taught. She taught herself to read ancient Greek, which Um,
Wow.
she taught herself mathematics and she went to some great schools, but like she was really kind of an autodidact. And then her first husband really discouraged her. He fortunately died. Her second husband thought this was great and like, you know, helped her gain footing in scholarly circles. And she ended up writing um, a translation of Laplace, which is much of the Ladies' Guide is based on.
That's
And she
awesome.
ended up writing a translation that was an expansion of one of his early volumes, and it became like the Oxford textbook for astronomy for like 75 years.
Wow.
And like people don't know her name nearly as well. People like to
No.
talk about Carolyn Herschel, first female professional astronomer. And I'm like, A, in Britain, yes. B, what about Mary Somerville, who ended up being the mathematics tutor to Ada Lovelace? So there's this whole like chain of lineage, and she had all these other brilliant women that she knew and corresponded with, and I think is, why don't we talk about her more? This is great. And she had this really happy second marriage where they were both brilliant. I think her husband, I think he was a botanist. I may have been making that
Oh,
up.
that's fun.
But yeah, and it was just amazing. And yeah, and so it really um it was also really startling to see that people were making the same arguments about women doing science in 1816 than they are making in 2019 and
Yeah.
2020. And it's like, yeah.
That was one thing that I wrote myself a note to say that, that was a lot of things that I saw that were like historically accurate, but that were also accurate to like our modern time, which is sad and also telling. Like, I think it's something that I think people generally tend to feel like, oh, well, now we've evolved. Now we're,
So
but
far, women are legally people. Well, sometimes, yes. Like, I mean, there's Alyssa Cole's A Princess in Theory has an epidemiologist heroine.
mhm,
Her interactions with this like douchebag lab partner of hers,
yes,
like I've never worked in a lab, but I did go to grad school and I know that guy and I hate that guy.
yeah, very, very much still around,
Oh
which
yeah. Sad to say, it's true.
Um, I thought it was like, well, I kept saying the polite science society that you named it. I kept like the polite, even in all my notes. It's like
What
polite.
was my favorite thing? Like that was the name that I didn't so much make up as cobble together, but like there's like the Polite Arts Manufacturing Group, and it means of the city, like political, like polis.
Yeah,
Um, but I'm like, oh, it's so perfect. It's the nice brigades. We know what this does, and
yeah.
it still makes me happy. Um, yeah.
Because you can't not see you can't not see that in there.
Yeah.
Pun. Okay, so Pris, I know when Megan and I were talking about the book, she was like, Pris is so selfish, and she was not like surprisingly selfish, but she was selfish. But I was thinking too, like, she's real practical. Like, she was just kind of like, well, this is the world we live in, this is what we're gonna do.
Yeah.
Not good at communicating to her people what her plans were, but
No,
definitely.
Chris is kind of terrible, and I keep trying to figure out how to give her and Henry like a happily ever after, and I don't know if I'll ever get to do it. But I love it when people turn villains into heroes.
Yeah.
I love that whole thing. I made Pris the worst. I'd have like a lot of uphill battles to fight there, but I kind of fell in love with Henry a little bit, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, I want to do right by this guy, but I haven't solved the problem of how.
Yeah. I don't know how you would do it, but I would be there for it. I thought she was the worst, but also very much a person who like assessed the situation and was like, well,
Yeah,
if I'm ever gonna get any sort of, how am I'm gonna do
exactly. Like,
this, and that's how
well,
it's gonna be.
I can never be truly happy. So what else do I have? I have stability. Let's go.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, she is practical, and she's dealing with a lot of pressures, and I'm sure, because what I was going for, I love the terrible ex. I really do. As a trope, it's always really fun to me, and it always is really interesting. Because terrible exes are defined differently depending on which book, and when they are specific, they can add such a counterbalance to the narrative. Like,
Mm-hmm.
Darcy wouldn't be nearly as interesting if we didn't have Mr. Collins and Wickham hanging around being terrible, kind of terrible exes or alternate like paths. I'm reading an advanced copy right now of Mia Sosa's upcoming The Best Worst Man, or The Worst Best Man.
I couldn't get to download. Anyway, sorry.
Oh, no.
No, you're fine.
Valley, it's super good. I'm absolutely loving it so far. And one of the reasons I'm loving it is you have a heroine whose marriage, she's jilted at the altar, essentially.
Yeah.
And because the groom's brother is his best man, and the night before the wedding they have some sort of drunken bar crawl chat that convinces the groom to ditch his bride at the altar, so she naturally blames the best man.
Yeah.
And then they're forced to work together. It's a rom-com for the ages, but they keep describing the ex-fiance in such perfect terms. Like, they describe him as like a really good resume, which is to say it's heavily edited and there's a lot of unsavory stuff that never makes it onto the page. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's so good and so boring. Like, you just know that guy is just wrong.
Yeah.
And it's just,
awesome.
I'm still like, that sentence may be the best sentence I've read all week, like hands down. I'm like, oh my God, people need to read this book.
I'm gonna read it as soon as I can get my hands on it. I'll go to NetGalley, see if they've got a copy for me that I can download.
Yeah, definitely give it a shot.
She's on my list regardless. I love Mia Sosa. What was I gonna say? So this book, even though it's like the one I've heard the most about, it's not your first by any means.
Oh gosh, no.
So
I think it's my 8th. Yeah. If
yeah,
you count the it's my 8th.
that's a lot.
Yeah.
So how did you find this different than some of your previous projects, or do you always start the same way when you're writing?
I actually did something new with this one, and I think it's because I sold it before it was done, but I sat down and I wrote out a full synopsis before actually writing the first draft. And it turns out that works really well for me. It turns out there's a lot of first draft problems I can solve in outline form. And it turns out that like doing the complete story and having that map means when I'm writing, I don't have to be looking too far ahead. I can just focus on solving the problem of how do I make this part the shiniest. And I did one other thing that I'm really happy I did, and that has really that felt like it made my writing take a big leap forward. And I told myself, partly I think because I thought I was just writing this for me, is I said, you can let go. You can describe everything you want to describe. You can just go all out. Because, you're just like, oh, I don't want to, before I was always like, okay, I don't want to waste anybody's time with like descriptive passages. No, turns out I'm really good at descriptive passages, and it's because I love them and because I know what they're there doing. Like, that's a lot of how I think I work as a writer. And I always responded to descriptive passages in other books as well. Like Dickens' A Christmas Carol at one point has that famous line about something glowing like a bad lobster in a dark cellar, and like the way they describe Scrooge's house. Dickens in general, like,
He does like to describe.
It does, but it's really active description. There's always emotional content, and there's a progression, and you feel like you have a sense of things, and I admire that. Melville does the same thing. I think that's why Jane Eyre works so well. Yeah, so many. Like recently, Kate Clayborne's love lettering as well.
Yeah, I did love that.
Like, especially like describing through the eyes of a lettering artist. So you feel like you're seeing the world a little differently. Like, you've got those like, lens, like bug lens glasses on, and everything looks a little kaleidoscopic. And so it's not quite realistic, but it's persuasive and arresting.
Yeah, I did think that love lettering, that was one of its, surprising for me because I wasn't expecting to get that out of it. But I love when a book can like kind of make me look at things a little bit differently, or make me feel like it's a different perspective. I think we read Marielle, her first like wolf book.
Oh yeah.
And that book
be so good. Those have been on my list for a while.
She's so clearly, like, her heroine is so clearly like a wolf that I was reading and kind of like, oh, this is not how I would think, but that's how she's thinking it. And so I think that it made me, I love that about certain writers who can I tend to think of them as kind of moody writers, where it's like it almost puts me in that frame of mind, and it's an interesting experience, and I love it. I think it takes a lot of skill. So thanks for that, because yes, I was looking up in the sky a lot while we were reading yours. Was your research any different? Like, were there any nuggets that you found that you couldn't include?
Oh God, yes. Well, that's how books 2 and 3 happen, actually. When I was talking to Avon about the author, or about the first book, my now editor came back with, "Oh, we really like this. Do you have like a series blurb?" And I'm like, I have half a book, like, but you know, I know an open-ended question when I hear one, and I'm like, okay, give me 5 minutes. And so I said, well, I don't have a series blurb, but I have some notes on books 2 and 3. And I took a chance. I'm like, okay, if they want series, then that's 3 books. And that sounds great. And I maybe could have pushed for 5. 5 might have been a bit much. 3 sounded like it's a reach, but it's the right number. And so I said, okay, so book 2, the heroines have these jobs, which were 2 jobs I hadn't really gotten to fit into book 1, but that had kind of come up in the course of the research. Because the other thing I did was I finally caved and bought myself a subscription to JSTOR, so I can swung through all of those old like journal archives and academic writing, and I'm like, oh my God, I've missed JSTOR so much. There's a lot more research you can do if you have access to even one academic resource, and it's just JSTOR was always my favorite in grad school, so I know it's not comprehensive, but it's so much more than I had before. And then book 3 was another pair that they sound like they match, and it happens to be that the things I picked really have a lot of places to overlap and weave these kind of experiences together. So book 2 is The Care and Feeding of Waspish Widows, and it's a beekeeper and a printer engraver. And so it's actually Agatha, who you met in Ladies Guide.
Okay, I was gonna say, I feel like we've kind of brushed up against the printer engraving world.
Yes. Yeah, so she's the heroine of book 2. I'm sorry I had to kill Thomas off. Spoilers. He was sweet. He had to go.
Poor Thomas.
Well, part of the problem was I knew like she was going to be, I thought initially in the initial manuscript she was a widow, and then I needed like Thomas to be there for some reason, and then I kind of had so much fun with Thomas, and I'm like, I love him so much, and I've already killed him, and I just feel bad.
You're like, I'm sorry, you have no future.
Yeah, you don't, but you get to be really good right now. Like, you get to be really wonderful. I'm so sorry.
That's so funny.
Someday I'm gonna write like the afterlives, where it's all the characters who've died, and they get to be like hanging out somewhere in like a vestibule.
At least he got to live his best life.
He did. He was a good man. He did his absolute best. And then so that's book 2. Book 3 is like a silk weaver and a piano tuner, and that's been and I'm like, why aren't people writing piano tuning heroines? Like, Beethoven had a female piano tuner for a few years. These women existed. They built pianos. So I've got this whole like musical family. So yeah, book 2 is skewing a little older, and book 3 is skewing a little younger, and it's gonna be super fun. I've just finished the outline for book 3, and I'm pumped. It is really gonna be great.
I'm excited.
And we're about to get the edits on book 2, and so it's all happening at once.
Seems like this is your life now.
Yes. Yeah, and I knew it was gonna be. When I sold my first manuscript, I got so excited that I had to I didn't even finish reading the email. I leapt out of my chair and ran up and down the stairs 4 times. And I called my husband, and the only word that was understandable was the word book. And somehow he understood what I was saying. But then it's 10 years later, and I just had this 3-book series, and this was the biggest leap forward my career has had. And I had one moment of, oh my gosh, that's amazing. And my second thought was, oh my gosh, what do I send them next? And I'm like, give yourself a minute. Let yourself enjoy this. Buy the champagne. You don't have to worry about that. You have 3 books to write now.
There will be time.
Yeah, I never thought of myself as ambitious or driven or any of that. And then I look back at the things I actually do and I'm like, oh no, my self-image is this kind of like dreamy, absent-minded professor type, and that's not actually borne out by the evidence.
No, I was gonna say the books that I have seen from you are not at all like laid back and just
No.
doing doing what's been done. So Megan had asked me to ask you about uh, I don't want to do spoilers, but I guess Oleron, and did you always know the twist that was going to come up at the end? Because I think partway through, both of us were like, maybe, and then yay, but then also like, oh, there's more.
Well, and that comes from doing a lot of the research. Was that I was looking into the history of things like you know, Black people in the 19th century, and then I was also looking into female mathematicians, and there was a woman named Emily du Châtelet, and she was an aristocratic mathematician. She hung out with Voltaire, like, you know, this whole big thing. At the same time, during the Napoleonic Wars, you have Alexander Dumas's father,
Yep.
who was Black and was running all of France's armies at one point. And so I'm like, oh, so you have, you know, very highly placed Black people in France, and you have very highly placed female mathematicians in France. And I just went, boop, and I'm like, oh my gosh, the Polite Science Society would hate it. And I'm like, yeah, this is fun. And then it gave Mr. Frampton something to do. He shows up again in book 3. Because
Great.
I love that man. I love him so much.
Too.
And we get to meet his dad, who's wonderful.
I have to tell you that I scared my dog when I got to that part, because I was like, ah! I was so pleased, and my dog was like, what is happening?
Yeah, I knew there was going to be something that Oleron did, and I just didn't know what it was until about like 3/4 of the way through when I was doing that synopsis, actually. So I'm like, aha! And so I was able to layer it into the text really nicely, because I knew what I had to foreshadow. And again,
that was awesome.
If I was writing the first draft, I wouldn't have figured it out till like the last chapters, like if I was trying to feel my way out. Whereas because I knew where I was going, I was able to kind of control the stakes and the hints. And I think
you were able to like drop little breadcrumbs along the way.
Exactly. Without like fully showing my hand, I think.
No, it was great. I was very pleased with myself that I figured some of it out, but then I was like, oh, and she still surprised me. It was good.
Oh yeah, no, she was fun to write. I always tend to fall in love with my secondary characters. Like I start off and I'm like, oh yes, my heroines, they're going to be wonderful. And then I'm always like, who's this jerk on the left? I love them. So there's always like somebody who I think is going to be like a comic foil who ends up being, or even like a semi-villain who ends up just being so specific and real. There's a gentleman whose name I shamefully forget in one of my earlier books, and he was just there to be really into food and to be really annoying to the heroine, because she's like, oh my god, we have nothing in common. He cares way too much about tea. Because he's like, no, you have to steep it for exactly this long, and you have to put lemon in it, and like all of this stuff. And he's just like super into it, and she goes, I am so bored. But I really liked all of the stuff that he was doing, and he ended up having a little side romance. And
oh, I love it.
I was just like, I just want this guy to be okay.
Okay, he might not have been right for her, but
yeah, but like her cousin, who was really into food, they started to bond, and then of course planning, like when their wedding was being planned, it gave like the sequel something to kind of orbit around. It was very fun. But
cool. Well, I love a good secondary character, and honestly, there are a lot of books that when I'm reading, I'm like, ooh, I want to see them. So it's very disappointing when you don't hear any more about them afterwards, for me anyway.
Madame la Marquise, like, man, I love her. I know there's a whole story there, and I'm like, I'm not sure I'm ever going to get to write that. But in my head, she's just such a badass. And she got that limp in some way, and I don't know how.
No,
like,
it's got to be a thing, though. There's a story.
Like, and I'm like, oh my gosh, of course. Like, and romance loves its, crotchety old ladies with a cane who go around like being snarky at everybody. Like, that's just standard. Yeah. But we do actually, if you want to know about, there is a prequel story that's coming. and I can't say too much about it yet, but there's a prequel story with Aunt Kelmarsh and Catherine's mother.
Ah, this is
And
very exciting.
it's Georgian, and it's, yes, there will be more information about that very shortly.
I'm really pleased.
Yeah,
Thanks.
I was really excited to get to write that.
So I need to find out then, or for I need to find out, but also for anyone who might be watching this, how do we keep track of all your latest happenings? How do we not miss out on these?
Well, that's very straightforward. I have a newsletter. If you go to oliviawaite.com, there's a newsletter. You click on that, you can sign up. It's free. It's very fun. It's once a month, if that. I try to send it out once a month, but sometimes, I miss and delay. It's not spammy. It's usually a collection of links, things I found in research, things that I've read that are interesting. There's book recommendations. There's news about my books and appearances. I tend to send out special newsletters about appearances as well, so you'll get multiple reminders. And also, you can always reply to the newsletter and ask for specific recommendations. So if there's a mood you're having trouble finding a book to fit, like I do bespoke book recs. So,
that's awesome.
Yeah, it's really fun.
But you also do, you have a column, right?
I do. Yeah, that's monthly at the Seattle Review of Books, and I always link to that in the newsletter as well. So
cool. So the newsletter will get you everywhere.
The newsletter gets you everything, yeah.
That's awesome. I'm trying to think. Oh, we always have a couple questions that we ask people. So Megan, what is your favorite trope to read?
Oh gosh. I have yet to meet a trope I don't love for some reason. Even if I'm picky about it, but my absolute go-to is probably Marriage of Convenience.
Yeah.
Every iteration.
Yeah. I also have a real hard time making decisions about my favorite of anything, because I'm like, well, if the sun is shining, but if it's raining, but if it's, there's music in the background, and there's always a time for all the things. But yeah,
Marriage of Convenience. The execution, I generally don't like Secret Babies, but there's books out there and I'm like, yes, this Secret Baby book, this is amazing.
Yeah.
So yeah.
But if we want to lure you, Marriage of Convenience will be the thing.
Yeah. You put that on the end of a hook, and I'm chasing it down the street like it's a cartoon dollar bill.
That's awesome. If we were to catch you unawares while you're in the middle of your writing, what would we see?
It's really not exciting. I mostly do it. I have a chaise longue, actually. I have a writing chair. This lovely apple green velvet that was a gift from my husband.
Do you know Bea in her books? I feel like I need to tag her on this so that she can.
Oh, for the fainting couch?
Yes.
Yes. Oh my gosh, I love her Pinterest board of all that. Oh my. No, this is a much more mid-century thing. It's very stocky with big, thick arms.
Better for writing than for.
But it is apple green velvet, so it's very pretty. But it's also very it's not a messing around chair. You park yourself in this, and I put the laptop, and the mini dachshund tucks himself against my hip and is like, oh yes, we are doing the works. I'll be right here if you need me, because he thinks his part of the job is being an armrest. He's very good at it.
It's very important. Proper positioning, ergonomics, all that.
Yeah. And so that's how I do. I read in the mornings and I write in the afternoons. And it means I'm not a prolific author. I write a book and a bit a year. But it also means that the stuff I write tends to be pretty solid. I don't have to do, I do a lot of revisions. I love editing, but I don't do a lot of wholesale rewrites. Usually if I'm going to rewrite a manuscript, I will actually kind of start from the beginning, and it'll just be a whole other thing. And I've done that with a couple of my trunked novels before, because, learning process.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's me and a laptop and a mini dachshund.
All tucked in the perfect configuration. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's actually very gentle ergonomically for the elbows. Probably not so good on the back. I need to get myself a bracier pillow, I think, for that.
It sounds like it's working for you though. I'm looking for the perfect writing space, but I have yet to find the exact spot. I'm I have an office. That chair is kind of wiggly for me.
Yeah, and it's hard.
Yeah.
I got used to things in working bookstores and retail and grad school, so I was always kind of on the move. And
Mm-hmm.
so, I'd go and I'd sit in one spot for, max 2 hours and do a bunch of work. And then I'd have to get up and move somewhere else and do some work somewhere else. And so that kind of rhythm tends to be really like good for me. So I sit for a couple of hours and then I get up and I go do some dishes and I get a bit of a break and then I come and I sit for another couple of hours. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, it's working, and definitely um, the your work that I've read has been great. So thank you so much for coming through and sharing with us too.
Happy.
I guess I think that's going to be that for this portion, and we'll put it on our Instagram. But then now there's that IGTV, so we're going to save it there.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, because
Yeah, I haven't played around with that yet.
our live ones would disappear, and it was like, this is very
Yeah.
sad. So,
Stories just vanish.
yeah, so these ones we'll be able to keep, and you can link to them if you want to and all that. So yay.
Well, that's wonderful.
Well, good. I'm gonna stop it there then.